Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique raining claw and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. So keep in mind that this is not a full comprehensive list and it is not family groupings. The better way to think about it is just different avenues that we're going to explore so that we can draw some relationships between the motions in this technique to other elements of the system. So let's start out with the concept of blocking. In this case, proper blocking as it relates to our positioning, both myself and my opponent. So let's start out with our base technique, raining claw. So what's happening here? So the person is punching on a vertical, right? So what are we doing? What we're doing is we're creating that margin for error, the plus X, and we're starting to do the block. And we're blocking in a very specific spot. Why? Because we want to stop that upward momentum. Okay? That's a vertical version. How about a horizontal version? Well, this would bring in, name your favorite technique, 5 swords, etc. But the important part here is what's going on. Again, we're creating that margin for error again, and we're blocking in a very specific point on the arm. In this case, on the inside of the arm. Why? Because if I weren't to do that, I would then have to worry about that punch. The opposite is also true. So if I'm throwing out something like a thundering hammer, name your technique from this side, I have to be above the elbow. Why? Because I have to start worrying about the elbow being used as a backup weapon. Okay, so we've done horizontal and vertical. What about a diagonal? This is bringing something like a circles of protection where we're in this point. If you notice, I'm below the elbow. Okay, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, they can start beginning to use that elbow against us. So we have to start worrying about that. What do we need to do in order to fix for that problem? Well, we've got the plus X, the margin for error, but what we need to do is immediately start getting into our claw here. And if you notice what's happening with the arm is also picking up that rule to where he can no longer hit me with that elbow, or in other words, I'm stopping him from trying to hit me with that elbow and then fully controlling the arm. Okay, that's the right side. Let's take this to the left side. Same rules apply here on the horizontal, at or below the elbow, and if we're on the outside of the arm, same thing. This will bring in something like a shielding hammer, sword of destruction, etc. Now things start getting a little bit different. Okay, so let's do the left side of this uppercut. So in this case, we could do the same thing we did in raining claw. That'd be okay, but we want to show you how to deal with it slightly different. In this case, this would be glancing wing. So the way we're dealing with the glancing wing is rather than using the shoulder as a pivot point, we're going to be using primarily our hand as the pivot point in order to divert that out of the way. And if you'll notice what's happening here is I'm keeping my arm in a position to where I can continue to do that block if necessary, but the primary idea here is diverting this out of the way so I no longer have to deal with that elbow anymore. Okay? This brings in a new concept. Whatever we can do with our hands, we can do with our feet. And with that, we can continue on from that glancing wing into something like a bowing to Buddha, which uses some of the same elements, but then it adds some more different elements or different considerations because of the fact we're dealing with this strong weapon. So if I was to try and do a raining claw here, what's the problem? Well, hardness of weapon to hardness of target. In this case, in a defensive manner. If I just try and block this, chances are my arm is going to lose against their block. And if I were to just do this, I then have to worry about that rule. He can then use that knee against me rather than the elbow like we did at the top. So how do we deal with this? The proper way to deal with this is do a combination of some of the techniques. So in this case, we're going to start with the forearm or the shoulder as a pivot point and then divert it out of the way. Very similar to what we did in raining claw and glancing wing. So if you notice what I'm doing is I'm moving that potential backup weapon and the major weapon out of the way so it can't be used against me. Okay? Let's talk about another way to do this. Something like a defensive cross, to where he starts to do the kick and I'm blocking below that knee again. Again, I have to worry about that knee being used against me, right? Or even worse, the hands. Okay, I'm not even considering what's going on with the upper body. But this technique does it in a unique way. This way, the way it does it is by locking out that joint and controlling the depth zone, which then controls the hand. And that's done like this. So through that pull, if you'll notice, they can no longer use that knee, and I'm starting to control those hands for a particular period of time until I get to my upper body strikes, which could either be strikes or defensive in this case. Okay, that brings us into another way to think about this. Let's say thrusting salute. They do the kick, and I do this block. Well, if you notice, it's not really a block per se. I'm blocking on the line of attack and stepping off the line of attack. In other words, I'm using evasion. So what about that backup stuff? Well, if you notice, I'm not on the line of attack, so I don't really have to worry about it as much as I do if I stay on the line of attack. And there's a variation on this, which would be buckling branch, where I'm doing the combination of both. If you notice, I've now turned their knee completely away from me, and I've stepped off the line of attack at the same time. So really my concerns are not that leg, but really the upper body and rotations, which I can use my upper body for. There's one more way to consider this, which is circle of doom. So if you'll notice the way circle of doom does it, is we're actually blocking below the knee at this point. So we're actually obeying the rule as we normally talk through, at or below the elbow on the inside and outside stuff. And the way we're doing this is very similar to the way we're doing defensive cross, by moving them out of the way, and like buckling branch, by moving to the rear. And we don't have to worry about that leg anymore. We can now concentrate on the upper body. So in summation, how did we relate rein and claw to other elements of the American Kenpo system? Well, in this case, through proper blocking, through positioning of ourselves and our opponent. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.